Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Reading Corner. I'm your host Renee, and I am here for you every Wednesday reading stories in the public domain. Today we are continuing on with Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell. Without further ado, let's get into it. Chapter 3. A Love Affair of Long Ago. I thought that probably my connection with Cranford would cease after Miss Jenkyns' death. At least, that it would have to be kept up by correspondence, which bears much the same relation to personal intercourse that the books of dried plants I sometimes see, Hortus Cissus I think they call the thing, do to the living and fresh flowers in the lanes and meadows. I was pleasantly surprised, therefore, by receiving a letter from Miss Pole, who had always come in for a supplementary week after my annual visit to Miss Jenkyns, proposing that I should go and stay with her. And then, in a couple of days after my acceptance, came a note from Miss Matty, in which, in a rather circuitous and very humble manner, she told me how much pleasure I should confer if I could spend a week or two with her, either before or after I had been at Miss Pole's. For, she said, since my dear sister's death, I am well aware I have no attractions to offer. It is only to the kindness of my friends that I can owe their company. Of course, I promised to come to dear Miss Matty as soon as I ended my visit to Miss Pole, and the day after my arrival at Cranford, I went to see her, much wondering what the house would be like without Miss Jenkyns, and rather dreading the changed aspect of things. Miss Matty began to cry as soon as she saw me. She was evidently nervous from having anticipated my call. I comforted her as well as I could, and I found the best consolation I could give was the honest praise that came from my heart as I spoke of the deceased. Miss Matty slowly shook her head over each virtue as it was named and attributed to her sister, and at last she could not restrain the tears which had long been silently flowing, but hid her face behind her handkerchief and sobbed aloud. "Dear Miss Matty," said I, taking her hand, for indeed I did not know in what way to tell her how sorry I was for her, left deserted in the world. She put down her handkerchief and said, "My dear, I'd rather you did not call me Matty. She did not like it. But I did many a thing she did not like, I'm afraid, and now she's gone. If you please, my love, will you call me Matilda?" I promised faithfully, and began to practice the new name with Miss Pole that very day, and by degrees Miss Matilda's feeling on the subject was known through Cranford, and we all tried to drop the more familiar name, but with so little success that by and by we gave up the attempt. My visit to Miss Pole was very quiet. Miss Jenkyns had so long taken the lead in Cranford that now she was gone, they hardly knew how to give a party. The Honourable Mrs. Jameson, to whom Miss Jenkyns herself had always yielded the post of honour, was fat and inert, and very much at the mercy of her old servants. If they chose that she should give a party, they reminded her of the necessity for so doing. If not, she let it alone. There was all the more time for me to hear old-world stories from Miss Pole, while she sat knitting, and I making my father's shirts. I always took a quantity of plain sewing to Cranford, for as we did not read much, or walk much, I found it a capital time to get through my work. One of Miss Pole's stories related to a shadow of a love affair that was dimly perceived or suspected long years before. Presently the time arrived when I was to remove to Miss Matilda's house. I found her timid and anxious about the arrangements for my comfort. Many a time while I was unpacking did she come backwards and forwards to stir the fire which burned all the worse for being so frequently poked. "Have you drawers enough, dear?" asked she. "I don't know exactly how my sister used to arrange them. She had capital methods. I am sure she would have trained a servant in a week to make a better fire than this. And Fanny has been with me 4 months." This subject of servants was a standing grievance, and I could not wonder much at it, For if gentlemen were scarce and almost unheard of in the genteel society of Cranford, they or their counterparts, handsome young men, abounded in the lower classes. The pretty, neat servant maids had their choice of desirable followers, and their mistresses, without having the sort of mysterious dread of men and matrimony that Miss Matilda had, might well feel a little anxious lest the heads of their comely maids should be turned by the joiner, or the butcher, or the gardener, who were obliged by their callings to come to the house, and who, as ill luck would have it, were generally handsome and unmarried. Fanny's lovers, if she had any, and Miss Matilda suspected her of so many flirtations that if she had not been very pretty, I should have doubted her having one, were a constant anxiety to her mistress. She was forbidden, by the articles of her engagement, to have followers, and though she had answered innocently enough, doubling up the hem of her apron as she spoke, "Please, ma'am, I never had more than one at a time," Miss Matty prohibited that one. But a vision of a man seemed to haunt the kitchen. Fanny assured me that it was all fancy, or else I should have said myself that I had seen a man's coat-tails whisk into the scullery once, when I went on an errand into the storeroom at night. And another evening, when our watches having stopped, I went to look at the clock. There was a very odd appearance, singularly like a young man squeezed up between the clock and the back of the open kitchen door, and I thought Fanny snatched up the candle very hastily, so as to throw the shadow on the clock face, while she very positively told me the time half an hour too early, as we found out afterwards by the church clock. But I did not add to Miss Matty's anxieties by naming my suspicions, especially as Fanny said to me the next day that it was such a queer kitchen for having odd shadows about it. She really was almost afraid to stay, for, "You know, miss," she added, "I don't see a creature from 6 o'clock tea till missus rings the bell for prayers at 10. However, it so fell out that Fanny had to leave, and Miss Matilda begged me to stay and settle her with the new maid, to which I consented, after I had heard from my father that he did not want me at home. The new servant was a rough, honest-looking country girl who had only lived in a farm place before, but I liked her looks when she came to be hired, and I promised Miss Matilda to put her in the way of the house. The said ways were religiously such as Miss Matilda thought her sister would approve. Many a domestic rule and regulation had been a subject of plaintive whispered murmur to me during Miss Jenkins's life, but now that she was gone, I do not think that even I, who was a favourite, durst have suggested an alteration. To give an instance, we constantly adhered to the forms which were observed, at meal-times, in my father the rector's house. Accordingly, we had always wine and dessert, but the decanters were only filled when there was a party, and what remained was seldom touched, though we had 2 wine-glasses apiece every day after dinner until the next festive occasion arrived, when the state of the remainder wine was examined into a family council. The dregs were often given to the poor, but occasionally, when a good deal had been left at the last party, 5 months ago it might be, it was added to some of a fresh bottle, brought up from the cellar. I fancy poor Captain Brown did not much like wine, for I noticed he never finished his first glass, and most military men take several. Then, as to our dessert, Miss Jenkins used to gather currants and gooseberries for it herself, which I sometimes thought would have tasted better fresh from the trees. But then, as Miss Jenkins observed, there would have been nothing for dessert in summer-time. As it was, we felt very genteel with our 2 glasses apiece, and a dish of gooseberries at the top, of currants and biscuits at the sides, and 2 decanters at the bottom. When oranges came in, a curious proceeding was gone through. Miss Jenkins did not like to cut the fruit, for, as she observed, the juice all ran out, nobody knew where, sucking, only I think she used some more recondite word, was in fact the only way of enjoying oranges. But then there was the unpleasant association with a ceremony frequently gone through by little babies, and so after dessert in orange season, Miss Jenkins and Miss Matty used to rise up, possess themselves each of an orange in silence, and withdraw to the privacy of their own rooms to indulge in sucking oranges. I had once or twice tried, on such occasions, to prevail on Miss Matty to stay, and had succeeded in her sister's lifetime. I held up a screen, and did not look, and as she said, she tried not to make the noise very offensive. But now that she was left alone, she seemed quite horrified when I begged her to remain with me in the warm dining parlour and enjoy her orange as she liked best. And so it was in everything. Miss Jenkins's rules were made more stringent than ever, because the trainer of them was gone where there could be no appeal. In all things else, Miss Matilda was meek and undecided to a fault. I have heard Fanny turn her round 20 times in a morning about dinner, just as the little hussy chose, and I sometimes fancied she worked on Miss Matilda's weakness in order to bewilder her, and to make her feel more in the power of her clever servant. I determined that I would not leave her till I had seen what sort of a person Martha was, and, if I found her trustworthy, I would tell her not to trouble her mistress with every little decision. Martha was blunt and plain-spoken to a fault. Otherwise she was a brisk, well-meaning, but very ignorant girl. She had not been with us a week before Miss Matilda and I were astounded one morning by the receipt of a letter from a cousin of hers, who had been 20 or 30 years in India, and who had lately, as we had seen by the army list, returned to England, bringing with him an invalid wife, who had never been introduced to her English relations. Major Jenkins wrote to propose that he and his wife should spend a night at Cranford, on his way to Scotland, at the inn, if it did not suit Miss Matilda to receive them in her house, in which case they should hope to be with her as much as possible during the day. Of course, it must suit her, as she said, for all Cranford knew that she had her sister's bedroom at liberty. But I am sure she wished the Major had stopped in India and forgotten his cousins out and out. "Oh, how must I manage?" asked she helplessly. "If Deborah had been alive, she would have known what to do with a gentleman visitor. Must I put razors in his dressing-room? Oh, dear, dear, I've got none. Deborah would have had them, and slippers and coat-brushes." I suggested that probably he would bring all those things with him. "And after dinner, how am I to know when to get up and leave him to his wine? Deborah would have done it so well. She would have been quite in her element. Will he want coffee, do you think?" I undertook the management of the coffee, and told her I would instruct Martha in the art of waiting, in which it must be owned she was terribly deficient, and that I had no doubt Major and Mrs. Jenkins would understand the quiet mode in which a lady lived by herself in a country town. But she was sadly flustered. I made her empty her decanters and bring up 2 fresh bottles of wine. I wished I could have prevented her from being present at my instructions to Martha, for she frequently cut in with some fresh direction, muddling the poor girl's mind as she stood open-mouthed, listening to us both. "Hand the vegetables round," said I, foolishly I see now, for it was aiming at more than we could accomplish with quietness and simplicity. And then, seeing her look bewildered, I added, "Take the vegetables round to people, and let them help themselves." "And mind you go first to the ladies," put in Miss Matilda. "Always go to the ladies before gentlemen when you are waiting." "I'll do it as you tell me, ma'am," said Martha, "but I like lads best." We felt very uncomfortable and shocked at this speech of Martha's, yet I don't think she meant any harm, and on the whole she attended very well to our directions, except that she nudged the Major when he did not help himself as soon as she expected to the potatoes, while she was handing them round. The Major and his wife were quiet, unpretending people enough when they did come, languid, as all East Indians are, I suppose. We were rather dismayed at their bringing 2 servants with them, a Hindu body servant for the Major, and a steady elderly maid for his wife. But they slept at the inn, and took off a good deal of the responsibility by attending carefully to their master's and mistress's comfort. Martha, to be sure, had never ended her staring at the East Indian's white turban and brown complexion, and I saw that Miss Matilda shrunk away from him a little as he waited at dinner. Indeed, she asked me when they were gone if he did not remind me of Bluebeard. On the whole, the visit was most satisfactory, and is a subject of conversation even now with Miss Matilda. At the time, it greatly excited Cranford, and even stirred up the apathetic and honourable Mrs. Jameson to some expression of interest. When I went to call and thank her for the kind answers she had vouchsafed to Miss Matilda's inquiries as to the arrangement of a gentleman's dressing-room, answers which I must confess she had given in the wearied manner of the Scandinavian prophetess. Leave me to repose. And now I come to the love affair. It seems that Miss Pole had a cousin, once or twice removed, who had offered to Miss Matty long ago. Now this cousin lived 4 or 5 miles from Cranford on his own estate, but his property was not large enough to entitle him to rank higher than a yeoman, or rather, with something of the pride which apes humility. He had refused to push himself on, as so many of his class had done, into the ranks of the squires. He would not allow himself to be called Thomas Holbrook, Esquire. He even sent back letters with this address, telling the postmistress at Cranford that his name was Mr. Thomas Holbrook, yeoman. He rejected all domestic innovations. He would have the house door stand open in summer and shut in winter, without knocker or bell to summon a servant. The closed fist or the knob of a stick did this office for him if he found the door locked. He despised every refinement which had not its root deep down in humanity. If people were not ill, he saw no necessity for moderating his voice. He spoke the dialect of the country in perfection, and constantly used it in conversation, although Miss Pole, who gave me these particulars, added that he read aloud more beautifully and with more feeling than anyone she had ever heard, except the late rector. "And how came Miss Matilda not to marry him?" asked I. "Oh, I don't know. She was willing enough, I think, but you know, cousin Thomas would not have been enough of a gentleman for the rector and Miss Jenkins." "Well, but they were not to marry him," said I, impatiently. "No, but they did not like Miss Matty to marry below her rank. You know, she was the rector's daughter, and somehow they are related to Sir Peter Airlie. Miss Jenkins thought a deal of that." "Poor Miss Matty," said I. "Nay, now I don't know anything more than that he offered and was refused. Miss Matty might not like him, and Miss Jenkins might never have said a word. It's only a guess of mine." "Has she never seen him since?" I inquired. "No, I think not. You see, Woodley, cousin Thomas's house, lies halfway between Cranford and Misselton, and I know he made Misselton his market town very soon after he had offered to Miss Matty, and I don't think he has been into Cranford above once or twice since. Once when I was walking with Miss Matty in High Street, and suddenly she darted from me and went up Shire Lane. A few minutes after, I was startled by meeting cousin Thomas." "How old is he?" I asked, after a pause of castle building. "He must be about 70, I think, my dear," said Miss Pole, blowing up my castle, as if by gunpowder, into small fragments. Very soon after, at least during my long visit to Miss Matilda, I had the opportunity of seeing Mr. Holbrook. Seeing, too, his first encounter with his former love, after 30 or 40 years' separation. I was helping to decide whether any of the new assortment of coloured silks which they had just received at the shop would do to match a grey and black mousseline de laine that wanted a new breadth, when a tall, thin, Don Quixote-looking old man came into the shop for some woolen gloves. I had never seen the person, who was rather striking, before, and I watched him rather attentively while Miss Matty listened to the shopman. The stranger wore a blue coat with brass buttons, drab breeches and gaiters, and drummed with his fingers on the counter until he was attended to. When he answered the shop boy's question, What can I have the pleasure of showing you today, sir? I saw Miss Matilda start, and then suddenly sit down, and instantly I guessed who it was. She had made some inquiry which had to be carried round to the other shopmen. Miss Jenkins wants the black sarcenet 2 and 2d the yard. And Mr. Holbrook had caught the name, and was across the shop in 2 strides. Matty! Miss Matilda! Miss Jenkins! Why, God bless my soul! I should not have known you. How are you? How are you? He kept shaking her hand in a way which proved the warmth of his friendship, but he repeated so often, as if to himself, I should not have known you, that any sentimental romance which I might be inclined to build was quite done away with by his manner. However, he kept talking to us all the time we were in the shop, and then, waving the shopman with the unpurchased gloves on one side with, Another time, sir, another time, he walked home with us. I am happy to say my client, Miss Matilda, also left the shop in an equally bewildered state, not having purchased either green or red silk. Mr. Holbrook was evidently full with honest, loud-spoken joy at meeting his old love again. He touched on the changes that had taken place. He even spoke of Miss Jenkins as your poor sister. Well, well, we all have our faults, and bade us good-bye with many a hope that he should soon see Miss Matty again. She went straight to her room and never came back till our early tea-time, when I thought she looked as if she had been crying. Chapter 4. A Visit to an Old Bachelor. A few days after, a note came from Mr. Holbrook, asking us, impartially asking both of us, in a formal old-fashioned style, to spend a day at his house, a long June day, for it was June now. He named that he had also invited his cousin, Miss Pole, so that we might join in a fly, which could be put up at his house. I expected Miss Matty to jump at this invitation, but no! Miss Pole and I had the greatest difficulty in persuading her to go. She thought it was improper, and was even half annoyed when we utterly ignored the idea of any impropriety in her going with 2 other ladies to see her old lover. Then came a more serious difficulty. She did not think Deborah would have liked her to go. This took us half a day's good hard talking to get over. But at the first sentence of relenting, I seized the opportunity and wrote and dispatched an acceptance in her name, fixing day and hour that all might be decided and done with. The next morning she asked me if I would go down to the shop with her, and there, after much hesitation, we chose out 3 caps to be sent home and tried on, that the most becoming might be selected to take with us on Thursday. She was in a state of silent agitation all the way to Woodley. She had evidently never been there before, and although she little dreamt I knew anything of her early story, I could perceive she was in a tremor at the thought of seeing the place which might have been her home, and round which it is probable that many of her innocent girlish imaginations had clustered. It was a long drive there, through paved, jolting lanes. Miss Matilda sat bolt upright, and looked wistfully out of the windows as we drew near the end of our journey. The aspect of the country was quiet and pastoral. Woodley stood among fields, and there was an old-fashioned garden where roses and currant bushes touched each other, and where the feathery asparagus formed a pretty background to the pinks and gillyflowers. There was no drive up to the door. We got out at a little gate and walked up a straight box-edged path. "My cousin might make a drive, I think," said Miss Pole, who was afraid of earache and had only her cap on. "I think it is very pretty," said Miss Matty, with a soft plaintiveness in her voice, and almost in a whisper, for just then Mr. Holbrook appeared at the door, rubbing his hands in very evanescence of hospitality. He looked more like my idea of Don Quixote than ever, and yet the likeness was only external. His respectable housekeeper stood modestly at the door to bid us welcome, and while she led the elder ladies upstairs to a bedroom, I begged to look about the garden. My request evidently pleased the old gentleman, who took me all round the place and showed me his 26 cows, named after the different letters of the alphabet. As we went along, he surprised me occasionally by repeating apt and beautiful quotations from the poets, ranging easily from Shakespeare and George Herbert to those of our own day. He did this as naturally as if he were thinking aloud, and their true and beautiful words were the best expression he could find for what he was thinking or feeling. To be sure, he called Byron, my Lord Byron, and pronounced the name of Goethe strictly in accordance with the English sound of the letters. As Goethe says, ye ever verdant palaces, etc. Altogether, I never met with a man before or since who had spent so long a life in a secluded and not impressive country, with ever-increasing delight in the daily and yearly change of season and beauty. When he and I went in, we found that dinner was nearly ready in the kitchen, for so I suppose the room ought to be called, as there were oak dressers and cupboards all round, all over by the side of the fireplace, and only a small Turkey carpet in the middle of the flag floor. The room might have been easily made into a handsome dark oak dining parlour by removing the oven and a few other appurtenances of a kitchen, which were evidently never used, the real cooking place being at some distance. The room in which we were expected to sit was a stiffly furnished, ugly apartment, but that in which we did sit was what Mr. Holbrook called the counting-house, where he paid his labourers their weekly wages at a great desk near the door. The rest of the pretty sitting-room looked into the orchard, and all covered over with dancing tree-shadows was filled with books. They lay on the ground, they covered the walls, they strewed the table. He was evidently half ashamed and half proud of his extravagance in this respect. They were of all kinds, poetry and wild weird tales prevailing. He evidently chose his books in accordance with his own tastes, not because such and such were classical or established favourites. "Ah," he said, "we farmers ought not to have much time for reading, yet somehow one can't help it." "What a pretty room," said Miss Matty, sotto voice. "What a pleasant place," said I aloud, almost simultaneously. "Nay, if you like it," replied he. "But can you sit on these great black leather three-cornered chairs? I like it better than the best parlour, but I thought ladies would take that for a smarter place." It was the smarter place, but, like most smart things, not at all pretty, or pleasant, or homelike. So, while we were at dinner, the servant girl dusted and scrubbed the counting-house chairs, and we sat there all the rest of the day. We had pudding before meat, and I thought Mr. Holbrook was going to make some apology for his old-fashioned ways, for he began, "I don't know whether you like newfangled ways." "Oh, not at all," said Miss Matty. "No more do I," said he. "My housekeeper will have these in her new fashion, or else I tell her that, when I was a young man, we used to keep strictly to my father's rule. No broth, no ball, no beef, and always began dinner with broth. Then we had suet puddings, boiled in the broth with the beef, and then the meat itself. If we did not sup our broth, we had no ball, which we liked a deal better, and the beef came last of all, and only those who had done it justice to the broth and the ball. Now folks begin with sweet things, and turn their dinners topsy-turvy." When the ducks and green peas came, we looked at each other in dismay. We had only two-pronged, black-handled forks. It is true, the steel was as bright as silver, but what were we to do? Miss Matty picked up her peas one by one on the point of the prongs, much as Amine ate her grains of rice after her previous feast with the ghoul. Miss Pole sighed over her delicate young peas as she left them on the side of her plate untasted, for they would drop between the prongs. I looked at my host. The peas were going wholesale into his capacious mouth, shovelled up by his large round-ended knife. I saw, I imitated, I survived. My friends, in spite of my precedent, could not muster up courage enough to do an ungenteel thing, and if Mr. Holbrook had not been so heartily hungry, he would probably have seen that the good peas went away almost untouched. After dinner, a clay pipe was brought in, and a spittoon, and asking us to retire to another room where he would soon join us, if we disliked tobacco smoke, he presented his pipe to Miss Matty, and requested her to fill the bowl. This was a compliment to a lady in his youth, but it was rather inappropriate to propose it as an honour to Miss Matty, who had been trained by her sister to hold smoking of every kind in utter abhorrence. But if it was a shock to her refinement, it was also a gratification to her feelings to be thus selected. So she daintily stuffed the strong tobacco into the pipe, and then we withdrew. "It is very pleasant dining with a bachelor," said Miss Matty softly, as we settled ourselves in the counting-house. "I only hope it is not improper, as so many pleasant things are." "What a number of books he has," said Miss Pole, looking round the room. "And how dusty they are." "I think it must be like one of the great Dr. Johnson's rooms," said Miss Matty. "What a superior man your cousin must be." "He's a great reader, but I am afraid he has got into very uncouth habits with living alone." "Oh, uncouth is too hard a word. I should call him eccentric. Very clever people always are," replied Miss Matty. When Mr. Holbrook returned, he proposed a walk in the fields, but the two elder ladies were afraid of damp and dirt, and had only very unbecoming calashes to put on over their caps, so they declined, and I was again his companion in a turn which he said he was obliged to take to see after his men. He strode along, either wholly forgetting my existence or soothed into silence by his pipe, and yet it was not silence exactly. He walked before me with a stooping gait, his hands clasped behind him, and as some tree or cloud or glimpse of distant upland pastures struck him, he quoted poetry to himself, saying it out loud in a grand, sonorous voice, with just the emphasis that true feeling and appreciation give. We came upon an old cedar tree, which stood at one end of the house. "The cedar spreads his dark green layers of shade." Capital term! Layers! Wonderful man! I did not know whether he was speaking to me or not, but I put in an assenting "wonderful," although I knew nothing about it, just because I was tired of being forgotten, and of being consequently silent. He turned sharp round. "Aye, you may say wonderful. Why, when I saw the review of his poems in Blackwood, I set off within the hour, and walked 7 miles to Misselton, for the horses were not in the way, and ordered them. Now, what colour are ash-buds in March?" "Is the man going mad?" thought I. "He is very like Don Quixote." "What colour are they, I say?" repeated he vehemently. "I am sure I don't know, sir," said I, with the meekness of ignorance. "I knew you didn't, no more did I, an old fool that I am, till this young man comes and tells me. Black as ash-buds in March. And I've lived all my life in the country. More shame for me not to know. Black! They are jet black, madam." And he went off again, swinging along to the music of some rhyme he had got hold of. When we came back, nothing would serve him, but he must read us the poems he had been speaking of, and Miss Pole encouraged him in his proposal. I thought because she wished me to hear his beautiful reading, of which she had boasted, but she afterwards said it was because she had got to a difficult part of her crochet and wanted to count her stitches without having to talk. Whatever he had proposed would have been right to Miss Matty, although she did fall sound asleep within 5 minutes after he had begun a long poem called Locksley Hall, and had a comfortable nap unobserved till he ended, when the cessation of his voice wakened her up, and she said, feeling that something was expected, and that Miss Pole was counting, "What a pretty book!" "Pretty, madam! It's beautiful. Pretty indeed." "Oh, yes, I meant beautiful," said she, fluttered at his disapproval of her word. "It is so like that beautiful poem of Dr. Johnson's my sister used to read. I forget the name of it. What was it, my dear?" turning to me. "Which do you mean, ma'am? What was it about?" I don't remember what it was about, and I've quite forgotten what the name of it was, but it was written by Dr. Johnson, and was very beautiful, and very like what Mr. Holbrook has just been reading." "I don't remember it," said he reflectively, "but I don't know Dr. Johnson's poems well. I must read them." As we were getting into the fly to return, I heard Mr. Holbrook say he should call on the ladies soon, and inquire how they got home, and this evidently pleased and fluttered Miss Matty at the time he said it. But after we had lost sight of the old house among the trees, her sentiments toward the master of it were gradually absorbed into a distressing wonder as to whether Martha had broken her word, and seized on the opportunity of her mistress's absence to have a follower. Martha looked good and steady and composed enough as she came to help us out. She was always careful of Miss Matty, and tonight she made use of this unlucky speech. "Ah, dear ma'am, to think of your going out in an evening in such a thin shawl. It's no better than muslin. At your age, ma'am, you should be careful." "My age?" said Miss Matty, almost speaking crossly for her, for she was usually gentle. "My age? Why, how old do you think I am, that you talk about my age?" "Well, ma'am, I should say you were not far short of 60, but folks' looks is often against 'em, and I'm sure I meant no harm." "Martha, I'm not yet 52, said Miss Matty with grave emphasis, for probably the remembrance of her youth had come very vividly before her this day, and she was annoyed at finding that golden time so far away in the past. But she never spoke of any former or more intimate acquaintance with Mr. Holbrook. She had probably met with so little sympathy in her early love that she had shut it up close to her heart, and it was only by a sort of watching, which I could hardly avoid since Miss Pole's confidence, that I saw how faithful her poor heart had been in its sorrow and its silence. She gave me some good reason for wearing her best cap every day, and sat near the window in spite of her rheumatism in order to see, without being seen, down the street. He came. He put his open palms upon his knees, which were far apart, as he sat with his head bent down, whistling, after we had replied to his inquiries about our safe return. Suddenly he jumped up. "Well, madam, have you any commands for Paris? I'm going there in a week or two." "To Paris?" we both exclaimed. "Yes, madam. I've never been there, and always had a wish to go, and I think if I don't go soon, I mayn't go at all. So as soon as the hay is got in, I shall go, before harvest time." We were so much astonished that we had no commissions. Just as he was going out of the room, he turned back with his favourite exclamation. "God bless my soul, madam, but I nearly forgot half my errand. Here are the poems for you admired so much the other evening at my house." He tugged away at a parcel in his coat pocket. "Good-bye, miss," said he. "Good-bye, Matty. Take care of yourself." And he was gone. But he had given her a book, and he had called her Matty, just as he used to do 30 years ago. "I wish he would not go to Paris," said Miss Matilda anxiously. "I don't believe frogs will agree with him. He used to have to be very careful what he ate, which was curious in so strong-looking a young man." Soon after this I took my leave, giving many an injunction to Martha to look after her mistress, and to let me know if she thought that Miss Matilda was not so well, in which case I would volunteer a visit to my old friend, without noticing Martha's intelligence to her. Accordingly, I received a line or two from Martha every now and then, and about November I had a note to say her mistress was very low and sadly off her food, and the account made me so uneasy that, although Martha did not decidedly summon me, I packed up my things and went. I received a warm welcome, in spite of the little flurry produced by my impromptu visit, for I had only been able to give a day's notice. Miss Matilda looked miserably ill, and I prepared to comfort and cosset her. I went down to have a private talk with Martha. "How long has your mistress been so poorly?" I asked, as I stood by the kitchen fire. "Well, I think it's better than a fortnight it is, I know. It was one Tuesday after Miss Pole had been, that she went into this moping way. I thought she was tired, and it would go off with a night's rest, but no, she's gone on and on ever since, till I thought it was my duty to write you, ma'am." You did quite right, Martha. It is a comfort to think she has so faithful a servant about her, and I hope you find your place comfortable. Well, ma'am, Mrs. is very kind, and there's plenty to eat and drink, and no more work than what I can do easily. But... Martha hesitated. But what, Martha? Why, it seems so hard of Mrs. not to let me have any followers. There's such a lot of young fellas in town, and many a one has as much as offered to keep company with me, and I may never be in such a likely place again, and it's like wasting an opportunity. Many a girl as I know would have 'em unbeknownst to Mrs., but I've given me word, and I'll stick to it, or else this is just the house for Mrs., never to be much the wiser if they did come, and it's such a capable kitchen, there's such dark corners in it, I'd be bound to hide anyone. I counted up last Sunday night, for I'll not deny I was crying because I had to shut the door in Jem Hearn's face, and he's a steady young man, fit for any girl, only I had given Mrs. my word. Martha was all but crying again, and I had little comfort to give her, for I knew from old experience of the horror with which both the Miss Jenkinsons looked upon followers, and in Miss Maddie's present nervous state this dread was not likely to be lessened. I went to see Miss Pole the next day, and took her completely by surprise, for she had not been to see Miss Matilda for 2 days. And now I must go back with you, my dear, for I promised to let her know how Thomas Holbrook went on, and I'm sorry to say his housekeeper has sent me word today that he hasn't long to live. Poor Thomas! That journey to Paris was quite too much for him. His housekeeper says he has hardly ever been round his fields since, but just sits with his hands on his knees in the counting-house, not reading or anything, but only saying what wonderful city Paris was. Paris has much to answer for if it's killed my cousin Thomas, for a better man never lived. Does Miss Matilda know of his illness? Asked I, a new light as to the cause of her indisposition dawning upon me. Dear, to be sure, yes. Has not she told you? I let her know a fortnight ago or more when I first heard of it. How odd she shouldn't have told you. Not at all, I thought, but I did not say anything. I felt almost guilty of having spied too curiously into that tender heart, and I was not going to speak of its secrets, hidden, Miss Mattie believed, from all the world. I ushered Miss Pole into Miss Matilda's little drawing-room, and then left them alone. But I was not surprised when Martha came to my bedroom door to ask me to go down to dinner alone, for that missus had one of her bad headaches. She came into the drawing-room at tea-time, but it was evidently an effort for her, and, as if to make up for some reproachful feeling against her late sister, Miss Jenkins, which had been troubling her all the afternoon, and for which she now felt penitent, she kept telling me how good and how clever Deborah was in her youth, how she used to settle what gowns they were to wear at all the parties. Faint, ghostly ideas of grim parties far away in the distance, when Miss Mattie and Miss Pole were young, and how Deborah and her mother had started the Benefit Society for the Poor, and taught girls cooking and plain sewing, and how Deborah had once danced with a lord, and how she used to visit at St. Peter Arley's, and tried to remodel the quiet rectory establishment on the plans of Airlie Hall, where they kept 30 servants, and how she had nursed Miss Mattie through a long, long illness, of which I had never heard before, but which I now dated in my own mind as following the dismissal of the suit of Mr. Holbrook. So we talked softly and quietly of old times through the long November evening. The next day Miss Pole brought us word that Mr. Holbrook was dead. Miss Mattie heard the news in silence. In fact, from the account of the previous day, it was only what we had to expect. Miss Pole kept calling upon us for some expression of regret, by asking if it was not sad that he was gone, and saying, "To think of that pleasant day last June, when he seemed so well, and he might have lived this dozen years if he had not gone to that wicked Paris, where they are always having revolutions." She paused for some demonstration on our part. I saw Miss Mattie could not speak. She was trembling so nervously. So I said what I really felt, and after a call of some duration, all the time of which I have no doubt Miss Pole thought Miss Mattie received the news very calmly, our visitor took her leave. Miss Mattie made a strong effort to conceal her feelings. A concealment she practiced even with me, for she had never alluded to Mr. Holbrook again, although the book he gave her lies with her Bible on the little table by her bedside. She did not think I heard her when she asked the little milliner of Cranford to make her caps something like the Honourable Mrs. Jameson's, or that I noticed the reply. "But she wears widow caps, ma'am." "Oh, I only meant something in that style, not widows, of course, but rather like Mrs. Jameson's." This effort of concealment was the beginning of the tremulous motion of head and hands which I have seen ever since in Miss Matty. The evening of the day on which we heard of Mr. Holbrook's death, Miss Matilda was very silent and thoughtful. After prayers, she called Martha back, and then she stood uncertain what to say. "Martha," she said at last, "you are young." And then she made so long a pause that Martha, to remind her of her half-finished sentence, dropped a curtsy and said, "Yes, ma'am, 22 last 3rd of October, please, ma'am." "And perhaps, Martha, you may some time meet with a young man you like, and who likes you. I did say you were not to have followers, but if you meet with such a young man and tell me, and I find he is respectable, I have no objection to his coming to see you once a week. God forbid," said she in a low voice, "that I should grieve any young hearts." She spoke as if she were providing for some distant contingency, and was rather startled when Martha made her ready, eager answer. "Please, ma'am, there's Jem Hearn, and he's a joiner making 3 and 6 a day, and 6'1" in his stocking feet. Please, ma'am, and if you'll ask about him tomorrow morning, everyone will give him a character for steadiness, and he'll be glad enough to come tomorrow night, I'll be bound." Though Miss Matty was startled, she submitted to fate and love. Chapter 5. Old Letters. I have often noticed that almost everyone has his own individual small economies, careful habits of saving fractions of pennies in some one peculiar direction, any disturbance of which annoys him more than spending shillings or pounds on some real extravagance. An old gentleman of my acquaintance, who took the intelligence of the failure of a joint stock bank in which some of his money was invested, with stoical mildness, worried his family all through a long summer's day because one of them had torn, instead of cutting, out the written leaves of his now useless bank book. Of course, the corresponding pages at the other end came out as well. And this little unnecessary waste of paper, his private economy, chafed him more than all the loss of his money. Envelopes fretted his soul terribly when they first came in. The only way in which he could reconcile himself to such waste of his cherished article was by patiently turning inside out all that were sent to him, and so making them serve again. Even now, though tamed by age, I see him casting wistful glances at his daughters when they send a hole inside of a half-sheet of notepaper, with the 3 lines of acceptance to an invitation, written on only one of the sides. I am not above owning that I have this human weakness myself. String is my foible. My pockets get full of little hanks of it, picked up and twisted together, ready for uses that never come. I am seriously annoyed if anyone cuts the string of a parcel instead of patiently and faithfully undoing it fold by fold. How people can bring themselves to use India rubber rings, which are a sort of deification of string, as lightly as they do, I cannot imagine. To me, an India rubber ring is a precious treasure. I have one which is not new, one that I picked up off the floor nearly 6 years ago. I have really tried to use it, but my heart failed me, and I could not commit the extravagance. Small pieces of butter grieve others. They cannot attend to conversation because of the annoyance occasioned by the habit which some people have of invariably taking more butter than they want. Have you not seen the anxious look, almost mesmeric, which such persons fix on the article? They would feel it a relief if they might bury it out of their sight by popping it into their own mouths and swallowing it down. And they are really made happy if the person on whose plate it lies unused suddenly breaks off a piece of toast, which he does not want at all, and eats up his butter. They think that this is not waste. We had many devices to use as few as possible. In the winter afternoons, she would sit knitting for 2 or 3 hours. She could do this in the dark or by firelight, and when I asked if I might not ring for candles to finish stitching my wristbands, she told me to keep blind man's holiday. They were usually brought in with tea, but we only burnt one at a time, as we lived in constant preparation for a friend who might come in an evening, but who never did. It required some contrivance to keep our 2 candles of the same length, ready to be lighted, and to look as if we burnt always 2. The candles took it in turns, and whatever we might be talking about or doing, Miss Matty's eyes were habitually fixed upon the candle, ready to jump up and extinguish it, and to light the other before they had become too uneven in length, to be restored to equality in the course of an evening. One night, I remember this candle economy particularly annoyed me. I had been very much tired of my compulsory blind man's holiday, especially as Miss Matty had fallen asleep, and I did not like to stir the fire and run the risk of awakening her. So I could not even sit on the rug and scorch myself with sewing by firelight, according to my usual custom. I fancied Miss Matty must be dreaming of her early life, for she spoke 1 or 2 words in her uneasy sleep bearing reference to persons who were dead long before. When Martha brought in the lighted candle and tea, Miss Matty started into wakefulness with a strange, bewildered look round, as if we were not the people she expected to see about her. There was a little sad expression that shadowed her face as she recognized me, but immediately afterwards she tried to give me her usual smile. All through tea-time her talk ran upon the days of her childhood and youth. Perhaps this reminded her of the desirableness of looking over all the old family letters, and destroying such as ought not to be allowed to fall into the hands of strangers, for she had often spoken of the necessity of this task, but had always shrunk from it, with a timid dread of something painful. Tonight, however, she rose up after tea and went for them, in the dark, for she piqued herself on the precise neatness of all her chamber arrangements, and used to look uneasily at me when I lighted a bed candle to go to another room for anything. When she returned, there was a faint, pleasant smell of Tonquin beans in the room. I had always noticed this scent about any of the things which had belonged to her mother, and many of the letters were addressed to her, yellow bundles of love letters, 60 or 70 years old. Miss Matty undid the packet with a sigh, but she stifled it directly, as if it were hardly right to regret the flight of time, or of life either. We agreed to look them over separately, each taking a different letter out of the same bundle and describing its contents to the other before destroying it. I never knew what sad work the reading of old letters was before that evening, though I could hardly tell why. The letters were as happy as letters could be. At least those early letters were. There was in them a vivid and intense sense of the present time, which seemed so strong and full, as if it could never pass away, and as if the warm, living hearts that so expressed themselves could never die, and be as nothing to the sunny earth. I should have felt less melancholy, I believe, if the letters had been more so. I saw the tears stealing down the well-worn furrows of Miss Matty's cheeks, and her spectacles often wanted wiping. I trusted at last that she would light the other candle, for my own eyes were rather dim, and I wanted more light to see the pale, faded ink. But no, even through her tears, she saw and remembered her little economical ways. The earliest set of letters were 2 bundles tied together and ticketed in Miss Jenkins's handwriting, letters interchanged between my ever-honoured father and my dearly beloved mother, prior to their marriage in July 1774. I should guess that the rector of Cranford was about 27 years of age when he wrote those letters, and Miss Matty told me that her mother was just 18 at the time of her wedding. With my idea of the rector derived from a picture in the dining parlour, stiff and stately, in a huge full-bottomed wig, with gown, cassock, and bands, and his hand upon a copy of the only sermon he ever published, it was strange to read these letters. They were full of eager, passionate ardor, short, homely sentences, right fresh from the heart, very different from the grand, Latinized, Johnsonian style of the printed sermon preached before some judge at assize time. His letters were a curious contrast to those of his girl bride. She was evidently rather annoyed at his demands upon her for expressions of love, and could not quite understand what he meant by repeating the same thing over in so many different ways. But what she was quite clear about was a longing for a white paduasoy, whatever that might be, and 6 or 7 letters were principally occupied in asking her lover to use his influence with her parents, who evidently kept her in good order, to obtain this or that article of dress, more especially the white paduasoy. He cared nothing how she was dressed. She was always lovely enough for him, as he took pains to assure her when she begged him to express in his answers a predilection for particular pieces of finery, in order that she might show what he said to her parents. But at length he seemed to find out that she would not be married till she had a trousseau to her mind, and then he sent her a letter which had evidently accompanied a whole box full of finery, and in which he requested that she might be dressed in everything her heart desired. This was the first letter, ticketed in a frail, delicate hand, from my dearest John. Shortly afterwards they were married, I suppose from the intermission in their correspondence. "We must burn them, I think," said Miss Matty, looking doubtfully at me. "No one will care for them when I am gone." And one by one she dropped them into the middle of the fire, watching each blaze up, die out, and rise away, in faint, white, ghostly semblance up the chimney, before she gave another to the same fate. The room was light enough now, but I, like her, was fascinated into watching the destruction of those letters, into which the honest warmth of a manly heart had been poured forth. The next letter, likewise docketed by Miss Jenkins, was endorsed, "Letter of pious congratulation and exhortation from my venerable grandfather to my beloved mother on occasion of my own birth." Also, some practical remarks on the desirability of keeping warm the extremities of infants from my excellent grandmother. The first part was, indeed, a severe and forcible picture of the responsibilities of mothers, and a warning against the evils that were in the world, and lying in ghastly wait for the little baby of 2 days old. His wife did not write, said the old gentleman, because he had forbidden it, she being indisposed with a sprained ankle, which, he said, quite incapacitated her from holding a pen. However, at the foot of the page was a small T.O., and on turning it over, sure enough, there was a letter to my dearest Molly, begging her when she left her room, whatever she did, to go upstairs before going down, and telling her to wrap her baby's feet up in flannel, and keep it warm by the fire, although it was summer, for babies were so tender. It was pretty to see from the letters, which were evidently exchanged with some frequency between the young mother and the grandmother, how the girlish vanity was being weeded out of her heart by love for her baby. The white paduasoy figured again in the letters, with almost as much vigor as before. In one, it was being made into a christening cloak for a baby. It decked it when it went with its parents to spend a day or two at Airlie Hall. It added to its charms when it was the prettiest little baby that ever was seen. Dear mother, I wish you could see her. Without any partiality, I do think she will grow up a regular beauty. I thought of Miss Jenkins, grey, withered, and wrinkled, and I wondered if her mother had known her in the courts of heaven, and then I knew that she had, and that they stood there in angelic guise. There was a great gap before any of the rector's letters appeared, and then his wife had changed her mode of her endorsement. It was no longer from my dearest John, it was from my honoured husband. The letters were written on occasion of the publication of the same sermon which was represented in the picture. The preaching before my lord judge, and the publishing by request, was evidently the culminating point, the event of his life. It had been necessary for him to go up to London to superintend it through the press. Many friends had been called upon and consulted before he could decide on any printer fit for so onerous a task. and at length it was arranged that J. and J. Rivingtons were to have the honourable responsibility. The worthy rector seemed to be strung up by the occasion to a high literary pitch, for he could hardly write a letter to his wife without cropping out into Latin. I remember the end of one of his letters ran thus: "I shall ever hold the virtuous qualities of my Molly in remembrance. Dum memoire ipse me, dum spiritus regret artus," which, considering that the English of his correspondent was sometimes at fault in grammar and often in spelling, might be taken as a proof of how much he idealized his Molly, and as Miss Jenkins used to say, people talk a great deal about idealizing nowadays, whatever that may mean. But this was nothing to a fit of writing classical poetry, which soon seized him, in which his Molly figured always as Maria. The letter containing the Carmen was endorsed by her. Hebrew verses sent me by my honoured husband. I thought to have had a letter about killing the pig, but must wait. Mem. To send the poetry to Sir Peter Airlie, as my husband desires. And in a postscriptum note in his handwriting it was stated that the ode had appeared in the Gentleman's Magazine, December 1782. Her letters back to her husband, treasured as fondly by him as if they had been M.T. Ciceronis Epistole, were more satisfactory to an absent husband and father than his could ever have been to her. She told him how Deborah sewed her seam very neatly every day, and read to her in the books he had sent her. How she was a very forward, good child, but would ask questions her mother could not answer. But how she did not let herself down by saying she did not know, but took to stirring the fire, or sending the forward child on an errand. Mattie was now the mother's darling, and promised, like her sister at her age, to be a great beauty. I was reading this aloud to Miss Mattie, who smiled and sighed a little at the hope, so fondly expressed, that little Mattie might not be vain, even if she were a beauty. "I had very pretty hair, my dear," said Miss Matilda, "and not a bad mouth." And I saw her soon afterwards adjust her cap and draw herself up. But to return to Miss Jenkins' letters. She told her husband about the poor in the parish, what homely domestic medicines she had administered, what kitchen psychic she had sent. She had evidently held his displeasure as a rod in pickle over the heads of all the ne'er-do-wells. She asked for his directions about the cows and pigs, and did not always obtain them, as I have shown before. The kind old grandmother was dead when a little boy was born, soon after the publication of the sermon. But there was another letter of exhortation from the grandfather, more stringent and admonitory than ever, now that there was a boy to be guarded from the snares of the world. He described all the various sins into which men might fall, until I wondered how any man ever came to a natural death. The gallows seemed as if it must have been the termination of the lives of most the grandfather's friends and acquaintance, and I was not surprised at the way in which he spoke of this life being a vale of tears. It seemed curious that I should never have heard of this brother before, but I concluded that he died young, or else surely his name would have been alluded to by his sisters. By and by we came to packets of Miss Jenkins' letters. These Miss Mattie did regret to burn. She said all the others had been only interesting to those who loved the writers, and that it seemed as if it would have hurt her to allow them to fall into the hands of strangers, who had not known her dear mother, and how good she was, although she did not always spell, quite in the modern fashion. But Deborah's letters were very superior. Anyone might profit by reading them. It was a long time since she had read Miss Chapon, but she knew she used to think that Deborah could have said the same thing quite as well, and as for Mrs. Carter, people thought a deal of her letters, just because she had written a piteous, but she was quite sure Deborah would never have made use of such a common expression as, "I cannot be fashed." Miss Mattie did grudge burning these letters, it was evident. She would not let them be carelessly passed over with any quiet reading and skipping to myself. She took them from me, and even lighted the second candle in order to read them aloud with a proper emphasis, and without stumbling over the big words. Oh dear, how I wanted facts instead of reflections before those letters were concluded. They lasted us 2 nights, and I won't deny that I made use of the time to think of many other things, and yet I was always at my post at the end of each sentence. The rector's letters and those of his wife and mother-in-law had all been tolerably short and pithy, written in a straight hand with the lines very close together. Sometimes the whole letter was contained on a mere scrap of paper. The paper was very yellow and the ink very brown. Some of the sheets were, as Miss Matty made me observe, the old original post, with the stamp in the corner representing a postboy riding for life and twanging his horn. The letters of Mrs. Jenkins and her mother were fastened with a great round red wafer, for it was before Miss Edgeworth's patronage had banished wafers from polite society. It was evident from the tenor of what was said that francs were in great request and were even used as a means of paying debts by needy members of Parliament. The rector sealed his epistles with an immense coat of arms, and showed by the care with which he had performed this ceremony that he expected they should be cut open, not broken by any thoughtless or impatient hand. Now, Miss Jenkins's letters were of a later date, in form and writing. She wrote on the square sheet, which we have learned to call old-fashioned. Her hand was admirably calculated, together with her use of many-syllabled words to fill up a sheet, and then came the pride and delight of crossing. Poor Miss Matty got sadly puzzled with this, for the words gathered size like snowballs, and towards the end of her letter Miss Jenkins used to become quite sesquipedalian. In one to her father, slightly theological and controversial in its tone, she had spoken of Herod, tetrarch of Idumea. Miss Matty read it, Herod, patriarch of Etruria, and was just as well pleased as if she had been right. I can't quite remember the date, but I think it was in 1805 that Miss Jenkins wrote the longest series of letters, on occasion of her absence on a visit to some friends near Newcastle upon Tyne. These friends were intimate with the commandant of the garrison there, and heard from him of all the preparations that were being made to repel the invasion of Bonaparte, which some people imagined might take place at the mouth of the Tyne. Miss Jenkins was evidently very much alarmed, and the first part of her letters was often written in pretty intelligible English, conveying particulars of the preparations which were made in the family with whom she was residing against the dreaded event. The bundles of clothes that were packed up ready for a flight to Alston Moor, a wild, hilly piece of ground between Northumberland and Cumberland. The signal that was to be given for this flight, and for the simultaneous turning out of the volunteers under arms, which said signal was to consist, if I remember rightly, in ringing the church bells in a particular and ominous manner. One day, when Miss Jenkins and her hosts were at a dinner party in Newcastle, this warning summons was actually given. Not a very wise proceeding, if there was any truth in the moral attached to the fable of the boy and the wolf, but so it was. And Miss Jenkins, hardly recovered from her fright, wrote the next day to describe the sound, the breathless shock, the hurry and alarm, and then, taking breath, she added, "How trivial, my dear father, do all our apprehensions of the last evening appear at the present moment to calm and inquiring minds." And here Miss Matty broke in with, "But indeed, my dear, they were not at all trivial or trifling at the time. I know I used to wake up in the night many a time and think I heard the tramp of the French entering Cranford. Many people talked of hiding themselves in the salt mines, and meat would have kept capitally down there, only perhaps we should have been thirsty. And my father preached a whole set of sermons on the occasion, one set in the morning, all about David and Goliath, to spirit up the people to fighting with spades or bricks, if need were, and the other set in the afternoons, proving that Napoleon, that was another name for Boney, as we used to call him, was all the same as Apollyon and Abaddon. I remember my father rather thought he should be asked to print this last set, but the parish had perhaps had enough of them with hearing." Peter Marmaduke Airlie Jenkins, poor Peter, as Miss Matty began to call him, was at school at Shrewsbury by this time. The rector took up his pen and rubbed up his Latin once more to correspond with his boy. It was very clear that the lads were what was called show letters. They were of a highly mental description, giving an account of his studies and his intellectual hopes of various kinds, with an occasional quotation from the classics. But now and then the animal nature broke out in such a little sentence as this, evidently written in a trembling hurry after the letter had been inspected. Mother dear, do send me a cake, and put plenty of citron in. The mother dear probably answered her boy in the form of cakes and goody, for there were none of her letters among the set, but a whole collection of the rector's, to whom the Latin in his boy's letters was like a trumpet to the old war-horse. I do not know much about Latin, certainly, and it is perhaps an ornamental language, but not very useful, I think, at least to judge from the bits I remember out of the rector's letters. One was, "You have not got that town in your map of Ireland, but bonus Bernandus non videt omnia, as the proverbia say." Presently it became very evident that poor Peter got himself into many scrapes. There were letters of stilted penitence to his father for some wrongdoing, and among them all was a badly written, badly sealed, badly directed blotted note. "My dear, 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 dearest mother, I will be a better boy. I will, indeed. But don't, please, be ill for me. I am not worth it, but I will be good, darling mother." Miss Matty could not speak for crying after she had read this note. She gave it to me in silence, and then got up and took it to her sacred recesses in her own room, for fear by any chance it might get burnt. "Poor Peter," she said. "He was always in scrapes. He was too easy. They led him wrong and then left him in the lurch. But he was too fond of mischief. He could never resist a joke. Poor Peter." And that is where we are going to leave it for today. Join me next time for the very interesting Chapter 6. If you like what I do here, please like, subscribe, and otherwise, I'll be seeing you guys next time. Bye!